Today, we will be listening to presentations on space, identity, and context. The first speaker will be Zeynep AKTÜRE. She received her degrees of bachelor's degree from the Middle East Technical University and her PhD from the same university in 2005. She currently teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on architectural design, architectural conservation in archaeological sites, and management of heritage sites. She participated in Erasmus teaching exchange programs, and she's a member of of many, the UNESCO World Heritage Program. Erhan Kurtarır is teaches at the urbanism and planning in METÜ. He worked on the Istanbul Cemevi inventory. Our third speaker will be Professor Ayşe Nur Ökten. She is a graduate of Boğaziçi University. She received her PhD from the Sociology Department of Istanbul University. She was she's emeritus professor, retreated in 2004. She works on epistemology and regional geography, human geography, and she publishes in these areas. We will listen to all three one by one after the other, and the first speaker will be Zeynep AKTÜRE. Her title is the transformation functional or ideological. Observations on the religious distribution of spaces that were re-functionalized. Dr. Erhan Kurtarır will be talking about the sacred places and places of worship as places of transforming identity in changing cities. The Professor Ayşe Nur Ökten will be talking on reflections on belief, identity, and interaction with space. So these are three presentations which really fit together. And as a whole, I would like to thank the speakers and now turn over the floor to Zeynep AKTÜRE.
Hello, I'm very happy to be a part of this event, and let me share my presentation with you.
Hakan hocamın da bahsettiği.
Now, as Hakan also indicated previously, actually, what I'm going to be talking about today is based on some observations, geographical distribution of ancient amphitheaters and Romanization versus Ottomanization and civilization as well, which is focusing on Romanization. And then what followed suit was states being formed and forced Romanizations in a multitude of separate processes, and the periphery, in a way, contributed to the reconstruction of the empire and contributed to multiculturalism within the spatial construction of the empire. Now, this made Constantinopolis adopt a more Byzantine spirit, and a transformation followed suit, and spatial distribution also gave way to Ottomanization as a result. Now, multi-culturalism of the Roman Empire and Ottoman Empire, Anadolu, Selçuk Sultanate, Keykubat, Sultanate, an epitaph used by that empire when they reigned over a majority of Christians, and Mehmet II also did the same. İnançları says that Constantinople was turned to this city, a Muslim city, by the second Mehmet, and the purpose here was to make sustainable the capital of a multicultural empire. Yerasimos says that in 1850, reforms were stipulated, and after 1453, many buildings were repurposed. In 1455, 42 churches are listed in the registry, and they didn't have community, so they were in a derelict status. And then we have two more lists, and you have 34 churches on these lists. 36 churches were turned into mosques. 28 of these have survived until today, as per several different resources. And in Galata, the Arab Jami is still present, but we're not going to be talking about that. The second Mehmet transformed 6 of the churches that I previously cited, and we will be looking at how these came to be. And in the time of the second Mehmet, transformations in religious buildings are fewer, and demolitions and repurposing other than mosques. And when we focus on the different parts of the city, the picture that we will see will be a bit different. Now, as for, like I said, ancient theaters, I worked on these quite extensively. Hagia Sophia and Kora were two focal points for me as part of that study. Austerlitz, after the 2nd century, in many Eastern Roman churches, starting from the palace, many rites took place in Hagia Sophia, but small communities had their own churches, chapels, and many other places of worship. The Zerek church mosque, the Pantokrator, is a great example of such a building, a monastery slash church repurposed for the Muslim community. Wide reaching transformations took place. And we have a lack of research on these buildings. But at the time of second Mehmet, certain Byzantine religious buildings were transformed, like I said previously, and their function before 1453, their size, their ayazmas, existence of ayazmas, and how they played a part in the transformation decision of these places is what I'm going to be talking about here today. And Magdalino, and also refer to Magdalino, and remember some of his writings. Now, second Mehmet in Constantinople, the first monumental building is actually at the center of the old peninsula, the palace, the old palace. Janissaries knocked the monastery down, and the second Mehmet stayed here. Most probably this was the Franciscan monastery. At the time, Necipoğlu in 1460 says that Topkapı Sarayı construction was initiated in a bid to build a symbol for the civilization that would reign over the Mediterranean. Byzantion's Acropolis Hill was here. The palace was built on that, and the courtyard was walled off. And before that, this was the Enderun. the courtyard, and then Birun, the outer courtyard versus the inner courtyard. The representatives of foreign states would get through this gateway. This is called Frengi, à la Franc. Once the main buildings were completed, Mehmet II, in the garden that also had a few churches, built certain Ale Greca, Ale Versiana, and Ale Turquesa, and only one, the tiled pavilion, survived until today. So 3 pavilions were actually built. When we look at written resources, we see that in this transformation, in the garden of the palace, the San Palos church was present, and this was a place of higher education, and then it was turned into a pavilion, Alla Greca, most probably. And in Sarayburnu, Ayasofya priests would stay in a monastery. The second Mehmet turned this into his summer residence. So, from a practical and aesthetic point of view, these transformations are quite substantial, and they tell us how the Byzantine buildings became a part of the Ottoman culture. And when we look at other practical implementations, for instance, the second courtyard, let's take a look at the second courtyard in the 5th century. A 3-naved church was present, but that was knocked down as well. At one time, it was a cemetery chapel, and this was turned into a cistern as well. Now, these functional changes meant that the religious functionality on top of the Byzantium hill ended with the construction of Topkapı. After Hagia Sophia, a second Byzantine church, Hagia Irini, was turned into a storage area where ammunition was stored. Storage buildings and service buildings in the external garden symbolize the strength of the previous empire. And this was an ideological message to the visitors of the newly established palace. Before the Ottomans, there was the Great Palace of the Byzantines and the Hippodrome, previously known as Hippodrome, and there were some functionality changes in the religious buildings there as well. Now, in the basement, wild animals of the palace would be kept, and also Halke church was known as Arslanhane, and once it became lost its function, a small temple was built. On the 10th century, it was enlarged into a church on Halke. On the 8th century, the there was an icon which was taken down, and that was the start of the iconoclasm movement. And Hagia Euphemia Church was turned into a storage area for powder kegs, and then the dome fell down. In the 6th century, Orthodox teachings were the basis of the church, and it's dated back to the 5th century, repurposed from a part of a previous palace. And around the At Meydanı, there are other small churches that were transformed, and in the time of the second Mehmet, some of these buildings were still intact. All of these actually are linked to the Great Palace and the palace that was built afterwards. And these changes in function are not observed in other parts of the city. These are highly symbolic buildings, and these transformations are also efforts to take away the divine features of these buildings. Around the shoreline of Haliç, the Theodosius Mosque was turned into a storage area, and then later the Gül Mosque. The most clear ideological message is probably on the most monumental religious buildings of the city. Let's now take a look at those. Changing of functionality, let's now take a look at Hagia Sophia, both a church and a mosque at the same time, a transitional image. Hagia Sophia is a monument of conquest, and when you look at the Great Palace, around the building that was in derelict state, and other buildings were used as storage areas after they were repurposed.
Bu dönüştürmelerden 10 yıl
These
kadar
transformations, 10 years before Havarian Church, the Church of the Apostles, was the office of the Patriarch, the second largest church, was a holy site. It was the highest hill of the city. Apostles were buried there, and many emperors were also buried there as well. And this was like a monument as well, but it was in a derelict situation, and there were Muslim people living around it. So the patriarchate had to move to Fanar. Today it's known as Fethiye Cami, but it's Pamachristos monastery church. After this move, the Church of the Apostles were knocked down. The second Mehmet's tomb was also put here in a complex. So instead of the martyrdom of the Christian emperors of the city, now you had Muslim emperors buried here. And then the first Fatih Mosque was built, and there might be physical connections between the previous church and this mosque. This was the first monumental church. It was built by a Greek architect. According to Dursun Bey, this was modeled after Hagia Sophia, the first version of Fatih Mosque. And again, this is a testament to the fact that the Byzantine legacy played an important part in formation of the new Ottoman identity and established a link with founding emperors, and from an architectural point of view as well, it served as a symbol of the city. Now, new cemetery in 1458, the first mosque in Eyüp was built actually during the conquest. Ebu Ayyub el-Ansari's tomb or shrine was the starting point for Eyüp Mosque. And on the hill, Cosmas and Damian brothers' shrines were present. A monastery was also present there. From the 6th century till 11th century, this was a place of healing. In 1470, this monastery's tower was still standing, and a domed church was added to the Eyüp complex, the Eyüp Külliye. So here as well, we see a continuity in the purpose of religiosity, and the ensign of the Prophet was put there as well. And Ottoman sultans would take their swords here in this place. And again, this is quite a link between the new Ottoman Empire and the Byzantine legacy. So the Fatih complex was repurposed. This is, and there are 5 churches in total that were repurposed. The first madrasa in the city was probably in Hagia Sophia, and there were priests' rooms that were used for training. And after 1466, in the north, new buildings were added up, and the second madrasa in the city, the 12th, the 12th century Pantokrator was built after Hagia Sophia. This was also repurposed. Molla Zeyrek Mehmet Efendi is the name of this building right now. 3 churches adjacent to one another were present. There was a monastery, 50-bed hospital, eye hospital, home for the elderly, and library. At the Latin era, this was the headquarters of the Venetians. And In the vicinity, you have a Pantetoktes monastery, and this was turned into an imaret. This is known as Eski İmaret Mosque right now. Actually, in Vefa, there's the Vefa Church Mosque, the Molle Gurani, also known as Molle Gurani Mosque. This has Byzantine catacombs or tombs underneath, and this is the church of three monasteries that used to stand there, most probably. Bozdan Aqueduct, you have the Kalenderhane Camisi or Kirotisa Church, and by second Mehmet, this was given as a tekke to dervishes, and it was given the name Kalenderhane. Apart from Hagia Sophia, we have these four examples. At the time of the conquest, these were not at the heart of the city, but they were populated by Muslims after the conquest. And these were all derelict buildings, and they were repurposed, these monasteries, because of practical purposes. These were repurposed, and the second Mehmet attached importance to lodging, housing, and education right after the conquest of Constantinopolis. Now, let me finish with examples where churches continue to serve as churches. Hagia Euphemia, Havarion, where saints' relics were kept, and the second Mehmet collected the relics for his own collection, it is known. And in the 5th century, Basilica Cistern, around Basilica Cistern, there was a building, one of the most important churches, Hypoparetia, dedicated to Virgin Mary. Certain relics were kept, and after certain restorations, again, it was there in a derelict state, and the second Mehmet restored it in 1485. It was turned into a mosque. The first Constantine died on the 21st of May, and relics were kept in Hagia Konstantinos and Hagia Elena church. And after 1453, Orthodox Karamanlis were brought in this area in Samatya. It was in a derelict condition, and it was turned into the Karamanlılar church afterwards. And the second Mehmet in 1461 appointed a religious leader from Bursa, brought them to Istanbul, and Panaya Peribeptos monastery was populated by Armenians, and it was used as a patriarchate building. It was given the name Surp Kevork, so it changed hands, but that's why it's known as the Bloody Church, because of the changing of hands from the Greeks to Armenians. In 1641, it was taken over by the Greeks, the Kumkapı Surp Asvasatsin Patriarchate, Akasius Metrafanes churches were built on these. It is thought in the basement of the church, Ayas Terafos Ayasma became or lost its function. As per Inalcik's data, in 1456 in Samatya, 42 Jews, 14 Greeks, and 13, these are families, Muslims, were living. The last two questions or examples actually give us an idea about the cultural transformation in the region between different religious Christian communities. And also, as we can tell from the pictures, last the three buildings were extended and a new agriculture architectural language was used. Yerasemos in the previous examples, we saw buildings that were turned into mosques, and these were churches that were used by different communities. So we have quite a lot of these, and these were quite important in the restructuring of the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Now, these transformations also give us ideas about the process of Ottomanization, the diversity of them, and the relationship between buildings and the dominant culture. Thank you.
Peki, çok teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi hemen ikinci sunuma geçebiliriz. Doktor Erhan Kurtarır, buyurun lütfen.
Thank you very much. We now go over to Dr. Erhan Kurtarır.
Merhaba, pardon. Bağlantıyı yapmak biraz zaman aldı.
Well, the link took some time to establish.
Şu an yansıdı mı acaba?
Can you see my presentation?
Evet, problem yok.
Well, no problem at all.
Hocam teşekkürler.
Thank you, sir.
Merhaba herkese. Ben aslında bugün son anda çıkan bir talihsiz bir sağlık durumu sebebiyle
Well, because of a special and immediate health problem that I had, I was not going to be able to participate, but finally I felt good, and so I came to make my presentation. I'm not going to stay long, I'm sorry, but I will try my best during my presentation. Together with this presentation, I would like to pose some question marks from my own professional point of view on the question of the transformation of identity and space that was also taken up, in the invitation that was sent to us. So this is well, yes, this is a reinterpreted version of what was discussed in that invitation. Well, now the world is becoming urbanized. Now we think in urban-centric form. All institutions refer to this. So international meetings, when they take up the questions of urban space, try to assess what happens when the urban space changes. Well, now 75% of the world lives, over 75% of the world lives in urban spaces. Of course, in such a world, this is a world that's fast urbanizing, and so cultural diversity is increasing, of course. Certain fundamental questions have to be posed. As an urban planner, I would share with you these three questions in my presentation. In such a culturally diverse environment, how does one provide for the continuity of the cultural identity? This is both for the dominant groups or for the subaltern groups. Every group has to march with the times and so change in its identity, but in the effort to continue one's cultural identity, what is the role of space? This is not very much discussed because our particular question in this case, for those who work on space, usually may abstract from identity, may ignore the question. So there has to be a kind of parallel established on the question of space and identities, those people who work on space and those people who work on identity. And finally, what is the role of planning which really prepares the future of these urban spaces? On the question of cultural identity, space, and planning, let's say a few things. Well, in the text that we sent you, a lot of detail is taken up on this question, but I will only touch upon certain questions. First of all, as a component of cultural identity, the identity of faith and religion really carries the marks of the past and overlap with the cultural traditions of the place in question. On the other hand, says the speaker, is the question of coming out on public sphere, on the public sphere. Faith and religion based cultural identity has to become public, it has to become visible, and it has the tendency to become spatialized. These public spaces serve to make the cultural identity visible and make it spatialized. This is in the nature of the culture in order to preserve the identity. Of course, when one does this, the public sphere, we should not forget that the public sphere is a space for domination. If this society is a society that has developed the skills of making different cultures and identities coexist, then of course the problem may be solved. But then if not, then you have to, I mean, this minor or subaltern identities have to receive the filter, go through the filter of the hegemony. Osman says the memory has a need of a space. This is what I would like to put forth as well. In order to discuss what we call space, well, I always try to give this as a message in my work as an urban planner. In the urban planning discipline, which is a child of modernism, looks at space from a secular point of view and does not really stress the question of the sacred, but societies don't, communities don't, cultures don't, etc. And so we have to understand the sacred space as well. In order to attribute meaning to this, we have to look at the question in depth. And this is one, it seems that this will become important in our discipline. When we talk about the sacred, what is this? This could be a corner in the middle of the nature. It could be a mountain like the Ararat. It could be a tree or a rock, but it could also be the human environment, like the memorial temple, or even a corner for praying. Then there is the question of the places of worship. Well, we have to say this frankly. In our legislation, up until very recently, there was no clear definition for this. And in the development plans, this was taken up very recently. The place of worship is not defined clearly in Turkey. There are negative aspects to this, but then sometimes this facilitates our business, because every institution has been asked, is this a place of worship on concrete situations? So in order to progress in this area, we need a clear vision and an attitude that is respectful for human rights. And I tried to make a general assessment from on the basis of my work. A place of worship is a social center of organization that has cultural, national, even ethnic significations. When we look at the definition, this is a place for assembly. Well, the root of the word, well, from the question of the cem-evi, cem means assembling, to the mosque, to the kilise, mosque in Turkish or Arabic is jami. This is, you know, what these words mean. During my research in England, I worked with the diaspora. The places of worship there turn into a kind of communal center, and people come together, you know, to be together, and they reproduce their relations there. Places of worship usually tend to reproduce their own cultural identity, but there the religious center becomes a kind of assembly place. This is the Shacklewell Lane Mosque in London, the Ramazan-ı Sherif Mosque in Turkish. This was a synagogue in the past, but then a Turkish Cypriot community bought this and turned into a mosque. You see how the Qibla is different here. They need to stand diagonally. Of course, the mosque is different from the synagogue. The synagogue has no space for the Qibla, but because this is a historic heritage site, they were not able to reconstruct it, and it was just converted into a mosque. But the one advantage is that there is a distinction between the places of worship between men and women, and this facilitates the situation. This is the first cem-evi in Cem House in London. And the space for this cem-evi was, in the past, a textile factory established by a Jewish businessman. So this is a public space that was created by converting just one floor of that building. So this question of conversion, depending on the needs, can be met in different manners, in different geographies, under different conditions. Well, in Turkey, when we look at the question once again, during my work, my research, I visited Greek Orthodox and Armenian Orthodox churches, and they said institutional structures that reproduce cultural identity on a faith-based direction follow the method. These places of worship are very important for the community. It's not a matter of only worshiping. Schools then are very important, especially in transmitting the culture to the younger generations. Endowments or foundations are very important with respect to the protection or the preservation of real estate and assets. Associations are very important. The media, of course, is important for the survival of the language, and cemeteries are there as spaces of cultural memory, and it's very important with respect to the belonging to the group. So we now have hints as to how cultural identity can be preserved. The same goes for both during my doctoral work for my doctoral dissertation and field work later. I looked at how sacred spaces are organized in the among the Alevi community. Well, there are fewer, there is less diversity in the Alevi environment. There are dergahs. These are very important with respect to the common memory and the cultural heritage spaces. These are the only ones within certain cities. New ones cannot be established in the centers of cities. You can only see these on the periphery of the urban area. There are isolated cases, but in general, this is not possible. You can find dergahs in the centers and in historic centers. Cem houses are both places of worship and cultural spaces, and they're multifunctional. These are very original spaces. I will be trying to come back to these. With respect to rituals, there are certain spaces. The question of visiting these spaces are very important. There are spaces of visit, and here nature has very important aspects, certain components of nature as well. Well, because the schools, etc., do not differentiate from the general structures, there is no such thing as an Alevi school. Those institutions we don't see. There are, of course, associations. With respect to the media, well, there are no community medias, but there are certain organs of media that continue, that sustain an Alevi kind of discourse. Now, the question of dergahs is important from the following point of view. Dergahs are in the center of the city. They serve as places which are demanded by the Alevis. There may be spaces that are destroyed or have changed their owners or changed their function, etc., etc. There are very few of these left. It is possible to increase the number, perhaps, but I have in Istanbul 25 of these dergahs and tekkes. Well, usually they're in Üsküdar, Kadıköy, Sarıyer. These are in the historic places of Istanbul. Well, these are not, these cannot be used, many of them, but they have to be restored. There are only 4 that are still extant. One of them is not a dergah anyway, but they are spaces that strive to continue the cultural identity. When we look at the gem houses, they are multifunctional. Well, one is that these are spaces that were established by the community, for the community. Not looking at the form of the space, they really eclectically form the space in a syncretic manner. This is how they were established. Because there is no supervision authority, the gem houses are really shaped by the needs, social, cultural, and faith centers are how they serve. From this point of view, they have very specific characteristics. Perhaps in the future, Yeah. Well, the global goals of coexistence really may be a kind of overarching structure under which these gem houses can serve. When I visited these, I took down the different kinds of activities. There may be other activities, but let me tell you, well, there is from ballet all the way to zikr, there are different kinds of activities. There's a lot of education given. Well, there are also, dental polyclinics in Kartal, for instance. Places of worship are, in effect, have such original structures, such differences in culture and identity that they cannot be uniform. So one cannot say the discourse of there's only one place of worship for Islam, because then that is the mosque. But even that is not possible. Every country has a kind of mosque that is peculiar to that country, because the cultures are different, the languages are different. So you can, narrow down to the subgroups, etc., and they want their mosque to be the way they want to run it. So these are all intracultural questions. It's part of the culture. The overall orientation is, of course, the same, but in the implementation, there are differences. What are the differences between the mosque and the gem houses? Well, first of all, there is the language difference. In the mosques, you pray in Arabic. In the gem houses, you pray in Turkish. With respect to the memory, the figures in the history of the faith are different, or perceived as different. The Qibla is different, because in the gem house, the Qibla is the human being. The symbolic language and the symbolic narrative in the space are different. There is a difference in the outlook on gender, and the feeling of belonging and owning up are different, because in one there is the belonging to the state in the case of the mosque, but the other one belongs to us, so to speak. The relationship to the common identity, and then of course there is the unity of origin. Well, from now on, what should be taken into consideration when we are conceiving of a future space of place of worship? We should talk about the different dangers. What are the dangers here? First of all, standardization and uniformization. This is the biggest danger, because it leads to the loss of original values. This may create a lot of problems, because all the richness and the diversity may go by the side. With decreased functions, these places may lose their real social function. The second has to do with sustainability. In order for these places to be economically and socially sustainable, they need to be supported on the basis of different activities, not necessarily commercial. Please don't understand it that way. These may be places where in the garden you can rest and you can use some certain spaces for other activities, etc., etc. It may serve other kinds of human relations. Of course, the question of the existence of an outward source of repression that could lead to a transformation and destruction. Well, of course, one always talks about a transformation, but the need for transformation can be done, carried out from the inside, or there could be destructive forces from the outside. Here, the decision should be given from the inside. The question of legal status and questions of property. Because many people don't know this. When I visited these places, does this have a status of place of worship? Yes, we talked to the municipality, etc. But when I looked at the development and zoning plans, there is no such breakthrough. These problems have not been solved, and this is a very serious problem. From the point of view of development, legislation, we still have a problem. Gem houses have not gained the status of place of worship. Let's say this is done in the future. Then this will become a public place. Well, many of the gem houses are under private property. And because they're under private property, they can do anything they like. But now, in the future, if this becomes the case, then the whole thing may change. The whole setup may change. Let me not go on and on, but among other threats or dangers, or at least the areas where we have to prepare, first of all, well, these have a kind of institutional heaviness and slowness in adapting to the growing diversity of the city. They need to recognize the phenomenon. From the point of view of city planners, we need a professional kind of attitude. What is the signification of that space? This question of signification should be inserted into the toolbox of the city planner. Finally, what can we talk about in terms of solutions? Well, we need a form of planning that is respectful for human rights and that regulates not space but places. Not only institutions, but also the planner should be part of the community and should update the instruments that they have and in a dynamic and proactive manner in order to answer the needs of the community. Well, the question, of course, the local, the flexibility, etc., etc. What is right and what is wrong? In the concept of planning, a new attitude of trying to understand and one has to reach a kind of understanding that looks for the implicit knowledge or information. And of course, we need planning in a comprehensive manner and that do not contradict the principles of human rights. This last slide. Well, my presentation is over. I asked about this structure in another session. Nobody could answer. There is no one single type. We should not see things uniformly. We need to allow for diversity in cultural structures in every sphere of life of humanity. And this is a mosque. And these mosques come from their cultural traditions. These are real works of art that are the product of great efforts. If mosques are so diverse, then you cannot reduce gem houses to mosques. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, and I wish you a quick recovery. Now we're going to the next presentation. Yes, ma'am.
Please unmute your mic. Sorry, I forgot to unmute my mic. Just a little bit of correction. Regarding my PhD, you said something which is not entirely correct. I didn't complete my PhD in sociology, but in economics. But I focused on sociology in economics. So I just wanted to clear that out. And now, let me proceed with my talk. In a way, Erdal, before me, presented us with a great plan, and I will focus more on methodology and organization, and try and give you some highlights. How did the planning mindset change, and how did that come into existence, and what our problem really is? And let me try and share my screen with you. Now, in my presentation, I will focus on three topics. One is how the handling of the space changed. Shatsky's site ontology is actually the theory that I will be talking about. How should we view space, and how should we establish the relationship between the space and the human? And this relationship-based approach started in economics and geography. It was developed as a school of thought. Bata's, his articles with Klüpler's articles were quite influential. And afterwards, in the planning area as well, Healy and Graham's articles, and you know, how to put it all into practice was the focal point of discussion. Management, sociology, all of these had reflections on this approach. Now, the ontology had to do with the philosophy, and relationship-based approach is mainly about how people interested in the space, in the site, should adopt their methodologies. The distinction between space and place, well, in geography, in humanitarian geography, you have this distinction. And sociologists also, Gearing in year 2000, had a great article about this. So sociologists are underscoring this distinction and telling us that this is important. I will also focus on that. So is this truly important? We will also get to that. The second topic, after the handling of space changed, one thing that we need to focus on is city policies and how planning responds to this new way of thinking. In urban policy making, in governance, or in public administration, the concept of governance came to the foreground, and the power of power, decentralization, localization, or giving more of a mandate to local authorities, and civil society organizations, their active participation in administration had an impact on planning, on decision-making processes, as well as the overall participatory attributes of the system. So participatory planning, in a way, is the concept that was brought into existence. Of course, there are different levels, and participatory planning, instead of participatory planning, citizen engagement concept is used. Which means that citizens should dedicate themselves to certain topics, or sort of should dedicate time and assume responsibility for certain matters. But by and large, regarding the city and policy and planning is changing. There are certain expectations and new thoughts. In light of all of these, when I look at our own country and the realities in Turkey, I see that in the planning practice, I think we need to discuss what's going on and what should be done. What are the things that we need to accomplish, and what are the hurdles in front of them? That's what I will try and convey to you during this talk. Now, as I said previously, and Erhan also talked about, the world is changing quite rapidly. On the one hand, we're going through the ramifications of globalization. On the other, the geography of production is changing. Wars, oppression all across the world are wreaking havoc on our communities, and minorities, are fleeing their homeland, and many people are being displaced. So all of these, actually, when it comes to planning, we need a more conceptualization, a richer conceptualization, because planning, yes, in the modern world, it's a modern concept, and as such, there are objective truths in here, and the urban city or space is organized based on that. But now people are saying that we need to adopt a new approach, and a new methodology is emerging, a new epistemology. So what is at the core of this novelty? Actually, there are two concepts. The first is Shatsky's space ontology. Space is a concept, he says, in terms of interpersonal relations. These relations can gain meaning through spaces, and through the wider geography within which they are situated. So location or space are things that create the link between people. And this is one of the main tenets. And another tenet is so how are we going to make sense of this concept? Again, relational approach or adherence of this school of thought say that spatial, economic, and social phenomena require a historic point of view, and things that happened in the past should be taken into account. So these things that happened in the past, when we look at their implications on today, we're also talking about a matter of scale, because when we talk about planning, actually, the point of view of planning on a given scale, on an urban scale, you deal with certain things, you assess them, and again, on an urban scale, there's a two-dimensional map that you try and find solutions on. But they say, relational approach adherents say that we can't just look at the scale of the city. I mean, this is a housing area, you say, you delineate a certain area, and how to build houses. The planner tries and define that, how many square meters per person, whether there's going to be a garden or not. So all of this is described. And those who advocate a relational approach say that this is not enough. people coming to the housing unit, what they go through, what they went through before they came there, and how this affects those people's habits. So in a way, you can't just take a look at the scale of the city. On an individual scale, on a psychological scale, you also need to take a look. And also from a sociological point of view, you need to take a look what is going on. That being the case,
mekan bir bağlamdır demek daha ağır bir görev yüklüyor mekan.
We can say that, I mean, saying space is a context puts a lot of responsibilities on the space, and saying that the space is a lens is not as strong a statement perhaps, but the space certainly predicates certain phenomena, or certain incidents manifest themselves based on the space that we're situated at. Just like a lens, they go through that lens and they can acquire different colors and hues. And Zimmer is at the basis of this thought. Zimmer, at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, was quite influential as a philosopher and sociologist. And in the 20s, he published certain articles, and he says that the society is like a web based on interactions of individuals. Whatever individuals go throughout their lives, all those experiences and counter relationships are shaped and formed, and all of us shape one another. It's like a web. Everything should be dealt with within the framework of relationship with others. So these relationships, different positions on the space have an impact as well. And Hakan in 2021 published an article, and he says space, different purposes, different organizations, different institutions come to a head at spaces. And this is the trouble for planners. How do you deal with different organizations, different purposes, and different institutions, and how to reconcile them? And how will the planner find solutions to all of that? And Dore Massey has this concept called sense of place, which is quite an important concept. They say, if you're dealing with a space, then sensations about that space should not be discarded. An important example from recent history is actually the Madımak Hotel in Sivas, which is a space that was an ordinary space, maybe a second-grade hotel, but then an atrocity took place there. People were burned to death. It was a catastrophe, and that place is no longer a hotel. It is a different sort of place. And those who do not get that, those who cannot internalize the importance of that sensation, those people have no qualms about turning it into, another commercial building, because in the plans, it's a commercial building. And many people wanted that place to function as a commercial place, a commercial building. But then there was a huge backlash because people have these sorrows and these sentiments about that place. So you need to adopt a different point of view for that place, from that point of view, after that point in time. Where does worship come into play in terms of methodology and organization? Worship is social and individual as an act, and for this act to be carried out, every space needs to be organized and things need to be put into order. And also you need social organization for worship to take place. So in the area of planning, when we deal with places of worship, we need to adopt a different point of view, a more pluralistic point of view, I would think. And in these places, how do you deal with the organization? such as some place like Hagia Sophia, if there are different demands, if there are, I mean, yes, it's all worship at the end of the day, but when we're talking about different groups, faith groups, how do you do that? How does a planner get around to that? Because a planner needs to propose solutions, and the planning entity, how are they going to be impacted by that? So actually, as an organization, when we look at the planning organization, actually it carries two meanings. The wide angle would be the organization, urban versus rural ways of living, and the values to govern those ways of living, acceptable and unacceptable sets of behavior. So in a broad angle, this is all within the same corporate framework, or institutionalized framework, but there's a narrower meaning as well. So that is that organization has a significance when it comes to coexistence, and it has a more practice-related or functional purpose. So functional organizations, how do they organize? Very briefly and very roughly, let me say that every corporate organization or every organization, in a way, is for a purpose, for a joint purpose. That's what you organize for. And there are different roles and responsibilities, terms of reference, a sort of a hierarchy. And these roles are assumed by certain people and certain organizations, how to act, how to behave, and in order to fulfill the ultimate goal, which rules need to be adhered to, and so on and so forth. All of this needs to be put down and laid down. So these organs of planning, these practitioners or implementers act within a framework of certain aims and certain definitions, and that's what they need to be working towards. And there's a problem in all of this, which is this. Defining means making sweeping statements or generalizations. Place of worship. What constitutes a place of worship? When you define that, you delineate things and you make a generalization. And that those that outside that generalization, all of a sudden, places are not dubbed places of worship, but for those who use those buildings, they are places of worship. So actually, Kong's official sacred concept comes into the picture. In our own part of the world, we see this quite often. Place of worship equals a mosque, or what is defined by law. These places are places of worship. Anything that falls outside that category cannot be seen as places of worship. Is Cemevi within the definition? No, then a Cemevi cannot be a place of worship. This is how things are. Definitions and definitions by and large mean generalization. So whether it falls into that or not, whether it falls into the mold or not, is what you look at. So inclusiveness, diversity, or in urban life, in planning, these principles that you'd like to adopt, or these principles you want to implement, are impeded. So how do you achieve that? In the practice of planning, can we come up with new solutions, or should this fall within the remit of the planning organization? To the right, you see some boxes and objective conditions and functional conditions. Now, there's a practical approach, and this is what it means, right? For an organization, you can set rules. You can say this person is going to be the director, and you have, you know, two auxiliary directors, and so on and so forth, and you can come up with terms of reference and tell them what to do. But if that implementer organization does not have the necessary objective conditions like the technical infrastructure, computers, employees, if there's a training deficit, if they lack planners, if they're not well trained, then that in practice means that you will not be able to fulfill your responsibilities. And in order to implement them all, implement your purposes, things can get complex.
In order for this to be implemented, the geography in which this space is situated has to interact with the institutions, because the conditions of life cannot be ignored in that locality. So the generalizations really cause problems because it ignores local culture. You cannot ignore these. So the planning institution and the operational organs that implement these plans are face to face with some fundamental problems or questions. One last slide. After having said all of this, when we look at the Turkish situation, what kinds of difficulties do we see? Well, difficulties in the way of the practice of planning in order to sustain the diversity in a multicultural city. There are many, but I chose 5. First, this is stressed in the literature. There has to be established a relationship between the geography of diversity and its representation. Those who write about this say that even if you want to represent this diversity, even here there's a problem because there are different faith and religion groups. So there needs to be solutions in order to reflect this diversity in space, because within the religions there are different faith groups. So you have to provide or produce a spatial solution to this problem. And then there are changes coming over time, and this is, you know, a requirement for flexibility. Can planning be so flexible? Well, second question is the climate produced by the politicians. This, of course, has its impact on practice in every areas. Many symbols in public spaces and the regulations in the public space. Well, you can think of Hagia Sophia as an example. The climate created by these elements then of course reduces the possibility of solution models in practice. So there's a serious problem if this is the case. Then there are contradictions created in the urban planning policy by the political climate. We have, of course, experienced this lately. It was in 1996, the Habitat 2 was held in Istanbul, And the question of governance and the participation of civil society, globalization, etc. This discourse was in vogue, and this had its reflections at the beginning of the noughties, the 2000s, and local government municipalities took over some powers from the central government, and thus while planning, certain decisions were given over to municipalities with respect to the organization of space. But in the last 5 or 6 years, is it too short? Perhaps 7 or 8. Within the last 7 or 8 years, there is a backlash. There are now administrators appointed to the head of municipalities. How can you have decentralization or devolution if you appoint administrators to municipalities even? So this devolution and governance really were hit hard. Another one is the turning over of the property from the the Metropolitan Municipality of Istanbul and being turned over to an endowment. It was Galata Port, the third bridge, Canal Istanbul. All these projects, these are shown as touristic site, or as if they were a national project. When this happens, local government, in this case, the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, finds many black holes, so to speak, in its web of powers. But the city is like a carpet. That is to say, there are different motives, patterns, in the carpet, which do not look alike. But when you bring them together, this really is a nice composition. So with the taking away of these powers from the municipality, certain vacuums or lakes or seas are formed in the power web of the municipality. Well, finally, the slow change in the characteristics of the planning practice, inherent in the planning practice. This is the Scottish question, as they call it in the literature. The planning is a big organization. I've changed the rules, you cannot say immediately. This is not sufficient in order to implement those rules because there is the human factor within organizations. Each individual, while working within an organization, brings together a cultural baggage. That's how they work. And well, we are making presentations on the same theme, but we have different presentations because our cultural and knowledge baggage is different. So in planning, participatory planning, in order to implement multiculturality, this is the type of solution proposed by planning experts, but in order to participate, we need to learn planning, how this should be implemented. This is one barrier that we have to overcome, but it is possible to overcome it. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, ma'am, Professor. Well, I would like to sum up from my notes briefly. We have very little time left, and then we will look at the questions that were asked. Either I will start or I will ask questions posed by our participants. As someone who works on space and identity, I am very happy to have listened to 3 wonderful presentations. In all presentations, within the context of examples and theories, the space identity relationship was taken up, and then the interventions and the symbolic and functional functions were taken up, and together with the last presentation were situated within a theoretical framework. Here, the fact that faith and worship were taken as the center really deepened the discussion. That was a good choice, and I think in this sense we had a very important, significant kind of session. Let me check if there are any questions that were written here. Well, there are many congratulations. Let me first talk about this. Well, I have a question for each. Well, I have one question for each participant. In order to elaborate on the question in the first presentation, Zeynep AKTÜRE, in your presentation, you said that the interventions made in Istanbul under Mehmed the Conqueror were both symbolic and functional. But because the inner city inside the walls were partially dilapidated or empty, this was important. Which ones were more dominant? Is it symbolic, or is it the functional ones, or is it the regeneration of the city in the decades following the conquest? I ask this because you said that the 2 churches changed for their function as churches. One church became the Patriarchate Church, and the other one became the Karamanlis Church. So it wasn't the function that changed, but the congregation that changed. So would you talk about this? There are 3 such examples that changed congregation. Well, this is what I tried to understand when I started my work. As far as I can read in the sources, the first priority is the re-functionalization of the city. Seems to be that. As part of that decision of resettlement after the city has changed hands, Mehmed the Conqueror left the city soon afterwards. Then the palace, the construction of the first palace started. Halil İnalcık talks about this. So many families should be resettled here is a beginning that they made. Later, these families were settled in compulsory manner. So the multicultural population structure, well, was a reflection of the empire. So perhaps if we look at the structures that changed hands from this point of view, for instance, in the pre-Ottoman period, there is a region where there are monasteries all the way to Chora church. There is a Turkish Muslim population that was settled. That's why probably. And to the south, Armenians were settled. Later, Jews were made to settle in another part of the city. But these are at the level of neighborhoods, population, and life. But these symbolic transformations may be only three. The building of the Fatih Külliye and the transformation of Hagia Sophia, perhaps those three are as important as this conversion, and they probably have ideological signification above all. So I'm really hard-pressed to say whether the weight lies here or there. If it's a matter of functional change, then of course it's the functional changes that are most important.
O noktaya bir şey yapıldığında geniş etkisinin olacağı bir kent müdahalesi.
Well, if you do something in a certain region of the city, then there, of course, is an intervention there and has an impact there. But then the impact of all these interventions are so great that you can probably see all three areas as equally important. Of course, this palace, the big kulliyes are very important. Then there are sub-regionalizations. There are the commercial areas. Then there are Muslim structures built in those areas, like the Muslim masjids. But when you go into the neighborhoods, then we see a different kind of tissue. So the changing of hands with respect to the, for instance, changing congregation, this is important, but that a third scale. I wonder if this kind of answer would satisfy you. Thank you very much. I have a second question, and that is for Ayşenur Öktem. Dear Professor, with respect to the difficulties in the participation in planning, does that owe to the coming about of the right to the city late? Can we read these together? Can we have a brief answer to this question? Of course, we can only think of this in terms of the right to the city. That's the only solution. Because, as I always say, certain generalizations are made. If you work on the basis of this right to the city, then these limits can be porous. So the right to the city is indispensable, and it's necessary for a scientific approach. But then it's difficult to adapt for persons and for institutions. Economic geographers use a concept of institutional dependence. An institution tries to protect itself. It's a matter of survival. They cannot change. They find it difficult to change. So there are certain techniques of implementation that are learned through practice. And now someone comes along and says, change this practice. And then there is a kind of conception that is based in these practices, and that does not admit the right to the city. So we have to change our philosophy of outlook on the city, and that's a normal kind of process. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to end this meeting because the next session will start immediately. You can always send your questions and comments through ADİP forum, that is to say ADİP Anadolu.org. Thank you for the speakers and to the participants, and see you again in future sessions. Thank you very much.